Hello everybody, my name is John Mark Johnson Jr. I'm the host of Relationship and Truth, and I'm very excited to be doing this second video in my series on LDS and biblical Christian communication. This is going to be the video in particular on the biblical historical, that is the Reformed worldview. The purpose for this series overall, as I was very clear about in the first video, is to communicate to LDS people the fact that they are wrong about what they believe, and I know that's a very bold statement. It's obviously not something that I would expect someone to accept just offhand, because some random person on the internet disagrees with Mormonism, disagrees with the LDS faith, therefore it must be wrong. Some random guy said so. No, I wouldn't. If somebody said that biblical historical Christianity was wrong, just out of the blue randomly, I wouldn't accept that. I don't expect Mormon people to do likewise. No, I would want someone who would critique my worldview and who would have issues with it to have actually first taken the time to understand what it is I believe before telling me why it's wrong. Well, in light of that fact, I have, in fact, tried to understand the LDS from them. I've gone to LDS sources to try to understand what they believe. So, as I mentioned in the first video, I've spoken with the LDS missionaries and stake presidents and bishops. I have read from official LDS sources that you can actually get from their online websites and also from within their church, so on and so forth, from the Four Standard Works, all that kind of thing. I have taken a lot of time to understand what they believe in their own terms, from their own sources, from their own people. And it's on that basis that I have issues. And it's on that basis that I'm trying to communicate with them. And so that first video that I did, which was talking about the LDS worldview, was to communicate to them that the issues that I have with your worldview aren't just the ratings of some random guy, but are concerns from someone who has actually taken the time to understand what you believe, and on that basis has problems with what you believe, and on that basis believes that you are in error. So that first video was primarily for LDS people, to show them that I cared enough about what they believe to actually figure it out and to learn it. But it also served a secondary role of helping other people in general understand the LDS worldview. There are lots of people who are communicating with each other, regarding what they think is right and what is wrong and all those kinds of things, and what people should and should not believe. And unfortunately, there isn't a whole lot of understanding out there. People don't always take the time to understand each other's worldview, and so I'm trying to help with that. Trying to help people understand, especially in this context, what these two sides would say to each other. You need to understand what the other side is really saying and really believes before you can really offer any kind of valid criticism. And it should be noted, I didn't have a chance to, well, mostly just because I didn't really think to be overly overt about it in the previous video, but it should be clear to anyone who listened to that video that I was presenting one particular view of LDS, of the LDS worldview. That is, there's lots of people out there that would call them themselves LDS or Mormon. There's a lot of variety out there in terms of what calls itself Mormon. You have, for example, the mainstream LDS church, which is more or less the worldview that I presented as basically as orthodox a form of it as I could find. And I did actually send that presentation to a couple of different people, one who is currently LDS and one who is formerly LDS, and asked them to look it over. The one who is currently LDS didn't have time to go through the whole thing because it was like 2 hours long, so I understood that he didn't have time to look over the whole thing. But the part that he was able to get through, which I understood to be the first part of the presentation, he said he didn't have any issues with. He agreed that he wouldn't have presented it in the way that I presented it. And in that presentation, I said I'm starting in a different place than LDS people would, etc., etc. He said, yeah, I want to present it the way that you presented it, but there was nothing wrong with what you said. You were accurate. So that was encouraging. And then the person who was formerly LDS that I sent it to, they did get a chance to go through the whole thing, and they said, yeah, that's what I believed as an LDS person, as a Mormon. And so I was very encouraged by that. But even though I had those people affirm that, yes, this is really what they believe, I understand that there is still a lot of variety in what calls itself Mormonism out there, because there's not just the mainstream Orthodox LDS Church. There is also splinter groups and split-off groups that would believe very different things. For example, there's the FLDS, the fundamentalists that still practice polygamy. There's the Community of Christ Church, that is the reorganized church that broke off from what has become the mainstream church at a very early point. And then, of course, there were those that were very much so dedicated to the temple lot, the original temple lot where the temple was supposed to be built, and you have the temple lot sect, and you have the Bickertonites, and lots of different groups over the course of history that have called themselves Mormon or called themselves Latter-day Saints. And there's no way in that 2-hour presentation that I made that I could possibly represent everything that calls itself Mormon. Well, in the same way, this presentation is not going to be able to cover everything that calls itself biblical Christianity. I'm going to have to be specific here, and I'm going to go with that form of biblical Christianity that I believe to be the most accurate to actually being biblical. The one that I would say, and based on my study of it, is in fact the most biblical, and that would be what we would call the Reformed worldview. And there's also a few different groups within that even. Pretty much everybody wants to call themselves anything that could be seen as advantageous. So there's tons of people in the world that call themselves Christians. There's tons of people in the world that call themselves Mormons. There's tons of people even that call themselves Reformed, like I am, and we don't necessarily mean the same thing by it. So to be a little bit more specific, I would be talking about conservative, confessional, and specifically post-millennial and theonomic Reformed Christianity. For a lot of you guys who are outside of Reformed Christianity, those terms are probably not going to mean a whole lot. And hopefully I'm going to explain it in such a way that that's not really necessary to the explanation. You won't have to understand that in order to understand the presentation. But my overall point is this. Not everything that calls itself biblical Christianity is actually is as accurate as other things that try to call themselves biblical Christianity. Just as not everything that would call itself Mormonism or the faith of the Latter-day Saints is necessarily as accurate as anything else that's out there. Just because someone calls themselves a Mormon doesn't mean that they actually believe what the Mormon Church teaches, so on and so forth. Same thing applies here. Just because someone calls themselves a biblical Christian doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to believe what I present here. Just because they even call themselves a Reformed Christian doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to believe what I present here. I have to narrow it down in order for it to be at all useful. So again, I'm trying to go with the most accurate to the Bible version of biblical Christianity. And just to recap a little bit of what I went over last time, this passage that I have here at the bottom of the screen is kind of the charter passage for this series. It is Proverbs 6, verses 16 through 19. And it says, "There are 6 things that the Lord hates, 7 that are an abomination to him, haughty eyes, a lying tongue, and hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked plans, feet that make haste to run to evil, a false witness who breathes out lies, and one who sows discord among brothers." I chose this passage because it contains some very fundamental concerns from each side. For myself, as a biblical Christian, I am very concerned with the fact that God hates a lying tongue and a false witness who breathes out lies. That is very concerning to me as a biblical Christian, because we value truth very highly. And we believe that truth is so important that if somebody refuses the truth in particular, that is something that can put them on a path to eternal destruction. And of course, we don't want that for anyone, and we don't want that for our LDS friends and neighbors either. But I also understand one of the concerns that the LDS people would have, and that is the fact that God hates one who would sow discord among brothers. And that's how a lot of LDS people, for better or for worse, would see me, as someone who is sowing discord among brothers. I'm, stirring up contention and bringing up all these, issues that I have with the LDS faith and trying to detract people from their LDS faith. And in that first video, I pointed out that both of these things, biblically, are things that God hates, and because of that, I believe both of them. But I also believe not just this particular passage in Proverbs, but I believe the whole of Scripture. And that means that when I go to apply these principles in my life, recognizing what God hates and trying to avoid them, I have to interpret them in light of everything that is done in Scripture. And there are, in fact, many places in Scripture where God's people, and even God himself, sows a fair amount of discord. And when you look at those passages, it is on the basis of bringing truth to people and making sure that the truth is presented to people. For example, when Jesus goes into the temple and he chases out the money changers, he's being rather discordant. There's no doubt about that. What he did was not exactly a pleasant thing. He was very much so being contentious. He was very much so being discordant. But the reason is why. Why was he doing that? It was because what those people were doing was against the truth of what God had determined the temple to be, what God had said the temple ought to be. These people were not doing. They were in error. And so in order to preserve the truth, Christ was behaving very contentiously, very discordantly with these people. And you also see it in various other places in the Bible. For example, you have Paul all the time going around on his missionary journeys, speaking to people in such a way that upsets the order of those places. He goes into places and he preaches the gospel to people, and it upsets people. There's, for example, the famous case in Ephesus where the people react so strongly and so violently to what Paul is saying because they recognize that what he is saying is against what they've been teaching and believing. This was a community of idolaters. These were people who made idols for a living, basically, especially the silversmiths making silver idols. And they recognized that what Paul was doing would destroy their business of making idols and selling them to people. Paul was being extremely discordant. But the reason why Paul was being discordant wasn't for its own sake. He wasn't sowing discord among brothers, among the Ephesians, just because he liked to see them pitted against each other and hate each other. No, he was trying to bring the truth of the gospel to them, and that's why he did this. It wasn't that Paul valued discord. It was that Paul valued truth. And truth, when it is presented in an environment of lies, is going to be discordant. And so, yes, I would absolutely abhor with you anyone who goes around sowing discord for its own sake. The Bible is very clear that that is wrong, that is evil, that is wicked. But the Bible also gives very clear examples of places where it is appropriate and right and even necessary to be discordant when a matter of truth is at hand. And when that is the case, we are to be truthful. We are to present the truth, even if it's unpopular, even if the people don't necessarily want to hear it, even if it causes great turmoil, as it did in Ephesus. Okay, so that is why I'm doing what I'm doing. I recognize that being discordant for its own sake is wrong. But if you really do believe a lie, and I stay silent about it, I am allowing that false witness to stand. And therefore I would be participating in that lie. I would be participating in that which God hates. Okay, so no, I do not participate in discord for its own sake. I do, just as God does, hate lies. Obviously, I'm not perfect as God is, but in striving to be godly, I hate lies as He does. I believe the LDS belief system to be a lie, and therefore I stand against it. So let's get on with the presentation. Let's help you understand what biblical Christians actually believe. In the last series, we talked about what the LDS people believe. Now we're going to talk about biblical Christians. So let's first talk about the references, just like I did in the last video. Where can you find this information? Where does it come from? And no surprise, hopefully, it comes from canonical scripture, what most people would call the Protestant Bible. Now, technically, these two things are not the same. Canonical scripture is technical verbiage in the modern age that refers to a specific understanding of what is and is not scripture. But for all intents and purposes here, it's basically the Protestant Bible, the 66 books of the Protestant Bible that most of us are familiar with. In the Old Testament, it would be Genesis through Malachi, and in the New Testament, Matthew through Revelation. 39 books in the Old, 27 books in the New. Like I said, they're not perfectly exactly the same thing, but this presentation, I want to keep it fairly short, and so we can't get into a lot of those things and still have time to discuss other things. So for now, suffice it to say that canonical scripture is basically the Protestant Bible. That's where you're going to find all of this stuff. I do realize that is a little bit vague, because the Bible is kind of big. There's a lot of parts to the Bible, and saying, oh, it's in there somewhere, just look it up on your own is kind of a mean thing to do. So down in the description box, I have a handout that goes along with this presentation, and you can print it off, and it will have a fuller list of references. That being said, I would strongly encourage you, just as I did in the last video, to go ahead and read fairly extensively in the Bible, just as I suggested that people in the last video read fairly extensively in the LDS sources. We oftentimes have a tendency to just look at points of disagreement, and we don't necessarily look at the whole in context and try to understand the whole for what it is. We just look at those things that we disagree with and basically look for reasons to hate it, which is not a very balanced way to look at someone else's worldview, just saying. So I would encourage people on both sides. Yes, I'm going to provide some more specific references because I get that this is kind of general, but please do look at the general. Please do look at as much of canonical scripture, as much of the Protestant Bible as you can. Just as I told people in the last one, look at the LDS sources for what they are. It's not going to hurt a biblical Christian to go through and read the Book of Mormon, or to read the Doctrines of Covenants, or the Pearl of Great Price, to go through and read some of the student manuals that the LDS Church puts out online for free. You don't have to have any special access to get to them. They're out there online. They're very much so available. All you have to do is basically just look them up, and they'll be there. It's not going to do you any harm to look at something in its entirety, and the same would apply here. Now, as to some things that will be helpful later on to understand about how biblical Christians approach canonical scripture, one of the first things that needs to be understood is that biblical Christians, particularly Reformed Christians, and as I said specifically, we're talking about conservative, postmillennial, theonomic, confessional, Reformed Christians, all those fancy theological words that have developed over time. When I'm talking about us who really strive to be as biblical as possible, it should be noted that it's the original languages that are preeminent for us. Okay, the Bible was not written in modern English, and it was not inspired in modern English. That is not what we would say is the locus of authority. If you want to understand the Bible as it was originally given, which is our goal, you're not going to get that in English. And so for us, the English is a very useful study tool, just because, a lot of us don't read the original languages, but it is not ultimately authoritative for us. Whenever there is a specific dispute about doctrine, a specific dispute about a particular element of theology, for us it always goes back to the original language. Okay, there's this phrase in English that might be vague about this, that, or the other, or might be disputed this way or that. But for us, that's not the important thing. The important thing is, what does it say in the original language? And the original language of the Bible is Hebrew for most of the Old Testament, Aramaic for a few parts of the Old Testament, and also like just a few phrases in the New Testament, and Greek for the majority of the New Testament. The majority of the New Testament is in what is called Koine Greek. And also, there is a Greek version of the Old Testament as well that is important, because much, if not all of it, was translated before or during the time of the New Testament writings. And a lot of the verbiage from that Greek form of the Old Testament winds up making its way into the New Testament. And so it helps you understand New Testament usage a lot better. But those are the three primary languages of the Bible, and ultimately they are what is authoritative for us, not the English. That being said, we still do use English translations of the Bible, and I would recommend that anyone who's interested in understanding the biblical worldview, in so much as they might not, have time to study 3 different languages, that they get themselves a good English translation of the Bible, and preferably multiple English translations of the Bible. 3 that I would recommend are the NASB, the New American Standard Bible is what that stands for. I would also recommend the ESV, the English Standard Version, and that's the version that I'm going to use throughout this presentation. And another one would be the CSB, the Christian Standard Bible. There is an older form of it that is also pretty good called the HCSB. That was the Holman Christian Standard Bible. They just simply dropped the H of it in recent editions to make it a little bit more general. But it's basically the same thing with some updates. I would recommend those 3 translations because they are fairly formal in the way that they translate. They try to translate the words themselves to make the original verbiage appear in English as best they can. They're not what is called paraphrastic. There are some translations out there that are very paraphrastic that there's a lot of interpretation in paraphrastic translations. A paraphrastic translation tries to take what is said in one language and make it full and rich in whatever translation they're translating it into, but in doing so they use a lot of license. For example, the Message Bible is a paraphrastic translation, and in Psalm 23 it has a very interesting translation. Some translations, a little bit more literal translations, will talk about preparing a feast or food in the presence of mine enemies, something to that effect. And in the Message translation, it adds quite a bit of detail. It talks about God preparing a 6-course meal for me in the presence of my enemies and things like that. It kind of adds to it in ways that are not really authentic to the original language. So I would suggest that you avoid those, but stick with fairly literal translations. And I would also say stick with fairly modern translations in the English language. One of the things that comes up a lot in various and not just with the Bible, but with various ancient documents, is that there'll be a translation that was done, umpteen years ago, and that will kind of be the standard translation that everybody uses, but it's not always the most accurate. And one of the bigger problems is that it gets used so much that people's thought process regarding that document winds up being based on the translation rather than understanding the original. How it got translated into English this one time becomes everything to some people, and because of that, the original meaning sometimes gets obscured because of this one translation's oddity and how they decided to translate a particular phrase. Whereas if you use modern translations and you use more than one of them, you can get a better understanding in terms of what you know in terms of modern English of what was said, and you can get it through multiple translations so you can compare and contrast them and get a better idea of what's actually going on. We are not big proponents of any particular translation by itself. We always suggest that you get multiple translations, read multiple translations, and be very wary of using things that have a lot of traditional baggage attached to them just because of their age. We say that not just with regard to the Bible, but anything in translation. There's also, for example, collections of the early church fathers that are like this. One of the more famous collections is the Schaff collection, is what it's called, from Philip Schaff. And the way that it's translated is kind of old. It was translated some time ago, and so the vocal patterns and the particular verbiage that is used is a little bit on the older side. And some people have made out the church fathers to say particular things based on that translation that uses some of the old-timey words and the these and the thous and things like that. That isn't necessarily what the original actually says. It's been misunderstood in the modern because the translation isn't modern. And there's a lot of traditional baggage that has come along with it, and it causes problems. So modern translations that are fairly conservative, these are all fairly conservative translations, and using more than one is a good idea. I will also recommend that if you're interested in understanding biblical Christianity as a whole, not just the Bible, but how these things have been understood and applied, that you would consider getting a study Bible. If you want to understand what I believe in particular, I would recommend what is called the Reformation Study Bible, and they have that in the ESV translation. I would definitely recommend that one. It is a good Bible for understanding the Reformed Christian worldview very well. And then there's also another one that is called just the ESV Study Bible. It's not Reformed, it's just the ESV Study Bible. And that broadens the spectrum out a little bit. It includes a lot more different groups that would call themselves biblical Christians than just the Reformed alone. So if you want to understand biblical Christianity as a whole, the ESV Study Bible is good. If you want to understand Reformed Christianity in particular, that one specific part of biblical Christianity that I belong to, I would recommend getting the Reformed Study Bible. All right, and last but certainly not least, it needs to be noted that biblical Christians have a well-developed set of principles of exegesis and hermeneutics. Those are terms that refer to how do we know that a particular understanding of a passage is correct. Exegesis refers to the drawing out of what is in the text, which is the goal of biblical interpretation, or the interpretation of any text, any kind of text, any piece of literature, is to draw out what the text has to say for itself, rather than making the mistake of putting things into it that are not necessarily what the text was trying to say, but putting things into it and interpreting it in a way that is more reflective of your own time and culture than the time and culture of the person who actually wrote the document. That would be eisegesis instead of exegesis. Exegesis is drawing out. Eisegesis, the wrong thing, is to put something into the text that actually isn't native to the text. And then hermeneutics is basically the set of rules by which you know that you're doing exegesis and not eisegesis. There's a lot of them, and we're not going to have time to go over the entire complex of it, but it can be summarized with this phrase: a due use of the ordinary means. That is something that you'll find in biblical Christian literature, our great creeds and confessions, things like that. When we talk about the Bible and understanding the Bible properly, we believe that it can be understood properly through a due use of the ordinary means. And this actually comes from Jesus' own treatment of Scripture. That is, there are several times in the Gospels where Jesus confronts people about their beliefs, and he responds with saying things like, "Have you not read what the Scriptures say? Well, how do you read it? But Scripture says, thus saith the Lord." And he goes on to quote some Scripture. Jesus doesn't take the time to say, well, how do your teachers interpret it? Or what has the magisterium, with the magisterial authority, said to you? How do your prophets say that it should be read? Etc., etc. No, he looked at ordinary people and assumed that ordinary people, as long as they were being diligent in their study, would be able to, in fact, understand what Scripture meant. It wasn't something that was super special, and this is something that even goes back into the Old Testament, even back to the beginning with Moses. Moses said to the people, once he had delivered the written word to them, the law of God written on tablets, he said to them, it is near you. It's not hidden up on some mountain someplace or in the deepest abyss. It is very near you. It is understandable. It is plain. It is not some highfalutin technical mystery. It is something that you would understand in the ordinary way you would understand anything else. And that is the basic biblical Christian worldview. The problem comes in, and the reason why we have so many rules of hermeneutics is that the kind of literature that we're talking about with the Bible is unique. It is special. Not to say that it is not unlike anything else completely and totally, but that it is not like it's not like say a newspaper. Not that a lot of people read newspapers anymore, but it's not like your morning newspaper. It's not like an online article. It's not like a text message. The Bible is made up of particular types of literature, and if you don't know anything about those particular types of literature, you're not going to understand them correctly. As an example, let's say that you have some kind of technical paper in some kind of technical research journal, and you take that technical paper with all of its scientific jargon and all of its conclusions from previous studies that it talks about and all of its acronyms and all these kinds of things, and you give it to an 8-year-old who can read, of course, at least we'd hope that by 8 years old they could read, and ask them to read this article and tell you what it means. Well, an 8-year-old doesn't know anything about that particular field, at least not in that kind of depth. Say if it is a biology paper, for example, most 8-year-olds haven't really studied a whole lot of biology, certainly not on the level that a graduate research paper is going to be written at. Most of, like I said, the acronyms and the special terms and references to previous studies and all those things are not going to make a whole lot of sense to them, and so they might come up with an explanation for what it means. But I guarantee you that their explanation for what it means, if they do come up with one, is probably not going to be overly accurate. When we say that the Bible requires a due use of the ordinary means, that emphasis on it being the due means that it corresponds to what it is. Just as you would not give an 8-year-old a technical research biology paper and expect them to get a whole lot out of it, we would not expect people who are not familiar with certain forms of ancient literature, who are not familiar with the worldview that produced that piece of literature, to get things right about it. And when you think about the Bible, it is actually fairly complex. It was written over a span of roughly 1,500 years, on 3 different continents by at least 40 different authors, and the whole thing is removed from us by at least 2,000 years and written in different languages than we commonly speak. It is very much so several times removed from us, just as that 8-year-old would be several times removed from that biology paper, that technical research biology paper. So most people are removed from the Bible. And so when we talk about a due use of the ordinary means, we say that you would understand it like you would understand anything else. But understanding anything else requires that you take the time to understand it for what it is. If you want to understand a biological research paper, you need to study biology. You need to know the kinds of acronyms that biologists use. You need to know something about the studies that have already been done, so on and so forth. If you don't do those things, you're probably not going to understand it correctly. Same thing with the Bible. We're not saying that any Tom, Dick, and Harry can sit under a tree with his Bible and say, oh, look, I've got everything down because this is what it means to me in my own little heart of hearts. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that we recognize what the Bible is. It is a Bible that was written over 2,000 years ago in a different part of the world, over a span of 1,500 years, on 3 different continents by at least 40 different people. It is not something that is going to be innately understandable to us. It's going to take time. It's going to take research. It's going to take understanding. But once you understand that worldview, once you do the research, then you can arrive at correct conclusions. Okay. It's not something that is hidden any more than a biological research paper is hidden. If you understand the context, you can understand the paper. In the same way with the Bible. If you understand the biblical world, you can understand the Bible. All right, so that's the background to what we're going to say. Let's go ahead and see, okay, what does this document that we call the Bible, the Protestant Bible, canonical scripture more specifically, actually teach? What is its worldview? What does it actually say? In the handout that is given with this presentation, like I said, down in the comment boxes, you will see this little diagram, and it's a fairly straightforward diagram. that, unlike the one that we did for the LDS worldview, is not cyclical. Instead, it's linear. That is, the biblical worldview has very much so a specific starting point and a specific end that it is working to. It does not cycle back on itself, unlike the LDS worldview. And so I'm not going to refer back to this diagram all that much. Like I said, if you want to print it out and follow along, that's just fine. But it is fairly straightforward and orderly. There's not much cycling around with this one, pretty much at all. So it's going to be a lot more straightforward in that regard. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about from eternity past. In the biblical worldview, there's basically only one thing that comes from eternity past, and that is the only true God. Only God, and what is innate to God, could in any way be said to be eternal. That is not the LDS worldview, but the biblical worldview. This is different from the LDS worldview in that in the LDS worldview, God was not always God. God always existed, at least as an intelligence, but he wasn't always God in the LDS worldview. For us biblical Christians, God was always God. And he is the one that everything comes from. And because of that, he is the only thing that can properly be said to be eternal. And you might ask, how do you know that? Well, there's lots of different reasons why you know that, but one of them is his name. The God of the Bible does have a proper name, and his name is Yahweh. And that is what the original language gives for him. The original Hebrew calls him Yahweh. In a lot of translations, it is translated as Lord, all in caps. That's this part right here. Whenever you see Lord, all in caps in a translation, it is translating the Hebrew word Yahweh. And this is a very interesting name, and it defines God in a very interesting way. It is basically the doer of the Hebrew verb hayah, and hayah is the Hebrew verb of being, to be. And so Yahweh is the one who does the being, the one who causes things to be, in a sense, the being-izer. It's kind of like the English word employ and the English word employer. Employ is the verb. The employer is the one who does the employing. So if you are employed, it means you got a job. The employer is the one who gave you the job. In the same way, Yahweh is the one who hayas, and so he is the one who causes things to be, the one who causes all things to be. That is his name. That's what his name means. And this is a name that, frankly, in the LDS worldview wouldn't make any sense. But it's there in the Bible. It's there in the original language. And like I said, it doesn't make any sense from the LDS worldview. In the LDS worldview, like I said, God himself is not eternal. Not everything comes from him. Matter doesn't come from him. Intelligences don't come from him. Law as a general category does not come from him in the LDS worldview. He's not the one who causes all things to be. He can reorganize them. He can refine them, but he cannot cause them to be. Well, in Hebrew, the God of the Bible's name literally means that he's the one who causes things to be. He is the being-izer, the one who causes things to exist, the one who brings existence itself into existence. That is what the name means in the Hebrew in the Old Testament, and in the New Testament they actually refer to him the same way. For example, the Apostle Paul in Romans 4:17 refers to God as the one who brings things to be from that which is not, who brings things to be out of nothing. Again, he's explaining it in Greek, but he's referring to the same concept of the being-izer, the one who can bring something into existence from nothing. And what's interesting is that when the early Jews and also the early Christians, including the apostles, when they translated Yahweh from the Hebrew in the Old Testament into the New Testament, they translated it with the Greek word kurios, which literally means master. And kurios is the literal Greek word that would be used when you're talking about the person who owns and controls a slave. That's what a kurios was. Someone who had complete control over someone else. And they used this as a translation of Yahweh because that was the implication that was understood to come from Yahweh, from that name. If this is the beingizer, the one who is in control of all being, guess who that makes him? It makes him the top dog. It makes him the one who's in charge. It makes him the master. That phrasing was not accidental in any way, shape, or form. It was a direct implication of what that name meant. Now, that's not the only way it ever got translated. There were early Jews and early Christians that would transliterate it into Greek as Yah-oh. That would be basically the closest Greek form to Yahweh. In Greek of the time, it would be Iota, Alpha, Omega, and that would be 2 syllables. Yah-oh, split at the iota, alpha, and the omega. Yah-oh. It would be basically the closest that you could get in Greek to pronouncing the Hebrew word Yahweh. So sometimes you would get it like that, but most of the time it was Kurios. And in the New Testament, it always shows up as Kurios. The New Testament authors never used Yah-oh. There were early Christians that used Yah-oh. Trying to think which one specifically. I think Justin Martyr was on that list of early Christians that used Yah-oh. And then there were certainly early Jews who used Yah-oh. We actually still have some of their manuscripts from the intertestamental period, like 1st century BC, 2nd century BC writings that we still have that translate the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek that use Yah-oh. I think one of them might have been from the Book of Deuteronomy that I'm thinking of specifically that translates it that way, but that's not here nor there. The overall point is that the God of the Bible, the reason why we consider him like we do, in part, is simply because of his name. His name doesn't make sense in the LDS worldview. The LDS worldview does not have a God who brings things into being. The biblical worldview has a God who brings things into being by name. That's what he's named. Just as in English, an employer is the one who does the employing, Yahweh in Hebrew is the one who brings things into being. He is the one that hayas. He is the one who causes things to be. That was the understanding in the Old Testament, and like I said, Paul represents that idea in the New Testament in Romans 4:17. I know that the LDS, of course, teach differently, and Joseph Smith himself taught that was a corruption of the text to say that God created anything. He believed, to use his verbiage, that some old Jew had corrupted the text. But the problem is that isn't something that just shows up in the Jewish literature. It also shows up in the New Testament as well as the intertestamental literature and the post-intertestamental literature. This is not some scribal accident. This is endemic to the worldview. There is no way that any reasonable person would look at the body of evidence and conclude that this is anything but what the original understanding was. All right. And that leads us to a very important conclusion. If he is the one who causes all other things to be, one of the things that should be readily apparent is that he is not like us. He is not like us. He is something entirely categorically distinct from us. He is, in fact, transcendent. He is beyond everything in created existence. He is not a part of it. And one of the problems that people have in general is that we often try to think of God in our terms. We try to think of him in terms that we're familiar with, in terms that are a part of the existence that we see and observe all the time. The problem, though, is that the God of the Bible isn't a part of our existence. He's the one who made existence itself, but he's not himself a part of it. He is the one who causes being. He's not a part of being in that sense. He is truly transcendent. And because of that, there are things that can be true of him that cannot be true of us. And this is where, for example, the doctrine of the Trinity comes into play. The doctrine of the Trinity from the biblical worldview, and we're not going to have time to get into this a whole lot, but from the biblical worldview, the doctrine of the Trinity is that God is one being we would say that he is ontologically one, but he is three persons. For us, when we think in terms of our existence and what we're familiar with, we usually conflate being and person. We look at our friend Bob and we see he is one being, one human being, Bob, and he is also one person, Bob. This being only has, one personality attached to it. It only has one expression, one overall will that we could attribute it to it. Unless Bob is a conjoined twin or something like that, but that's not exactly what we're talking about. That would be two beings that just happen to be fused together, but we would still recognize that as very much so being two different beings and two different persons. And for everything in created existence, that makes sense. But God is not a part of our created existence. And so the Bible teaches that there is one Yahweh. Very, very clearly in the Bible it teaches that. And in the handout for this presentation, I go through several of the passages that very clearly teach there is one Yahweh. But the Bible also teaches that the Father is Yahweh, that the Son is Yahweh, and that the Holy Spirit is Yahweh. And it even goes on from there to say that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit all have their own distinct wills, and they are in some way distinct from each other. Biblical Christians look at this, and instead of trying to force God into our categories, we recognize the basic truth about God, that he is Yahweh, he is the beingizer, he is the one who brings things into being. He is fundamentally not like us. And so even though those statements are confusing to us, we recognize that he isn't bound by our existence. And to try to put our category boundaries on him are not appropriate. In so much as the categories are in fact distinct, they can apply to him. We oftentimes conflate being and person because that's natural to our existence, but technically they're not the same thing. For example, even in our existence, we would admit that things like rocks and lamps and cups all have being, but they don't have person. They don't have a will of their own. They have being, but not person. Person and being are not the same thing. And as long as they are not the same thing, even though we can't think of something in this existence that would have multiple persons in the same being, that doesn't mean it can't apply to God. If he isn't bound by our existence in the same way we are, and as long as the categories are truly distinct categories, being and person are not the same thing, a rock can have being, but that doesn't mean that it has person, then it can apply to God. And in so much as that is what the Bible reveals about God, that there is one Yahweh, there is one being of God, but that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, which are distinct from each other, are also this Yahweh, we understand God to be what he claims to be in the Bible. That doesn't mean that we understand him to be like us, but we understand him to be what he has revealed himself to be. He is not like us, and he is such that he is one being and three persons. That could be a very long discussion for further avenues of examination, but the basic reason why we accept the doctrine of the Trinity is because we do not make the mistake of thinking that Yahweh is bound by the constraints that we're bound by. For us, we're stuck with being in person being conflated in our persons, in our beings. Each of us is one being and just one person. The only reason why you would think that that would in any way be true of God is if you think that God is constrained by the same things you are. God of the Bible, he is not, and therefore that's where the doctrine of the Trinity comes from. It comes from the recognition that he is not like us. Also, the purpose of God is to glorify himself. This is different from the LDS worldview, where their Father God has exalted himself and is now in the process of leading his children to exaltation. In the LDS worldview, the point is exaltation. God exalts himself, and we, through God's help, exalt ourselves. Exaltation is the goal. In the biblical worldview, it is the glory of God that is in view. And God uses us as the means to glorify himself. He is going to glorify himself in particularly two general ways, by displaying his justice and by displaying his mercy in our lives and how we interact with each other in human history, so on and so forth. Okay. In the LDS worldview, there is a sense in which it is very much so all about you. Not entirely, but it is about you in the sense that your goal in life is to exalt yourself. In the biblical worldview, it's not about you, it's about God. You exist to glorify him. Again, that is a radical and complete difference. Now, there's also something that is innate to God. We wouldn't say that it is God properly, but it is innate to God, called the covenant of redemption. And this comes from the nature of God in general. The biblical God being the beingizer, among other things, is omniscient. He knows everything from the beginning. He's also omnipotent. There's lots of passages that we could go over to talk about God being omniscient and omnipotent and all those kinds of things. But in terms of just understanding the worldview, the important thing is that since God knows everything, and since God does all things and can do all things, the net result is that he is the one who, in a sense, brings all things into being, and is the one who orchestrates all things. Put more simply, God planned everything beforehand. That is what we call the covenant of redemption. God decided to create a world in which there would be people who would need to be redeemed. And that was his plan from the very beginning. None of this that happened on earth caught God off guard or anything like that. It was the plan from the beginning. In that sense, it would be somewhat like the LDS worldview, in which Father God plans from the beginning for there to be a process of exaltation. This is somewhat comparable to that. But the difference, though, is that the God of the Bible doesn't have just a plan to bring everything into, just have a plan for people to follow, but he actually effects that plan. He brings it into being. He executes that plan thoroughly and completely. He doesn't just throw it out there and say, okay, do your best to fulfill this. He is the one who orchestrates its accomplishment and guarantees its accomplishment. And that's why we don't call it, say, the plan of salvation or the plan of redemption. Instead, we call it the covenant of redemption. It is a promise and a guarantee. That's what we mean by covenant in this particular case. It is a promise and a guarantee. People will be redeemed, and particular people will be redeemed, and there is nothing that is going to happen that is going to stop it, because God is God, and he is going to do exactly what he set out to do. It's not just a plan. It is more than a plan. It is a covenant with effect, with a guaranteed effect. It is a covenant and a guarantee. It is a promise and a guarantee, I should say. All right, so that's what comes from eternity past in the biblical worldview. God properly is the only thing that comes from eternity past. And the reason why we can say that is in part because of God's name. God is named the beingizer. Everything that exists that is not God came from God. What does that mean? It means that he's the only thing that's eternal. Everything else comes from him. And because everything else comes from him, everything has an existence that is dependent on him. We shouldn't think that he is like anything else in existence. He is not like us. And that explains why we can believe in the doctrine of the Trinity. We accept the Bible's teachings about God as they are, and we don't try to rationalize them in terms of our experience in existence, because our experience in existence is derived. It is not innate to what limits God. He is beyond us. He's transcendent from us. And so the doctrine of the Trinity is basically an admission that he is not like us. We also accept that his purpose is to glorify himself. He does that through demonstrating his justice and mercy in our lives. We exist to glorify God and to enjoy him forever, as the Heidelberg Catechism says. But our purpose is found in him. We do not exist to exalt ourselves. We exist to glorify him. And then we have for us a covenant of redemption, not just a plan of redemption, but a covenant, a promise and a guarantee that God definitely will do what he plans to do. It's not just hoping, but he's going to accomplish it. All right. Also in points of what we've just said, there's one particular passage from the Bible that I wanted to bring up, and that is Deuteronomy 4:15 through 19, that says as follows, "Therefore watch yourselves very carefully, since you saw," and by the way, this is Moses speaking to the Israelites, before they're going to enter the promised land. He's reminding them of everything that has happened to them and all that God has spoken to them. And this is what he's saying to them. He says, "Therefore watch yourselves very carefully, since you saw no form on the day that Yahweh spoke to you at Horeb out of the midst of the fire. Beware lest you act corruptly by making a carved image for yourselves in the form of any figure, the likeness of male or female, the likeness of any animal that is on the earth, the likeness of any winged bird that flies in the air, the likeness of anything that creeps on the ground, the likeness of any fish that is in the water under the earth. And beware lest you raise your eyes to heaven, and when you see the sun and the moon and the stars, all the host of heaven, you be drawn away and bow down to them and serve them, things that Yahweh your God has allotted to all the peoples under the whole heaven." I bring up this passage in conjunction with what I just said about God's name. I said that one of the reasons why Christians believe that God is not like us is because he's the beingizer. He's the one from whom all being comes. That means that being as we know it, existence as we know it, is not a constraint upon God. He's the one who makes existence. He is not constrained by existence. This passage gives us another reason why we believe that he is not like us. In this passage, Moses is talking to the Israelites, and he's warning them against idolatry in a very simple sense. But in this passage specifically, he tells them not to make a carved image. And a lot of people think, making a carved image is obviously bad and all. We certainly wouldn't want to do that. It's bad to make an image, make some carving out of stone or wood or whatever the case happens to be, and say that that's your God, because God is, not a piece of wood, obviously. But that's not the force of this passage. That is not how this passage would have been understood in the original language. In the original language, the word that is used for carved image here implies an archetype. And even how Moses introduces this, he introduces it by saying that you saw no form on the day that Yahweh spoke to you at Horeb. When God spoke to you out of the cloud, you didn't see any form. For Moses, the reason why making a carved image is bad is because you are indicating not just that God is perhaps this piece of wood or stone or metal or whatever the case happens to be, but you're saying that God is like that image in some way. You're saying that the archetype that image represents somehow is indicative of what God is. That is the error of iconography. And that's actually the word that is used in translation here in the Greek Old Testament. As I mentioned before, the Greek Old Testament forms largely the foundation of the Greek New Testament. And in the Greek Old Testament, they use the word icon here for a carved image. And that word implies an archetype. The problem isn't just that you're making this thing, calling it God, but you're saying that God is like whatever you're making an image of. He's like this or he's like that. Not just that he is wood, stone, metal, whatever the case is, but he's like whatever you made this image of. That is an affront to God. That is evil, wicked, and wrong. And notice what kinds of things Moses points out here. That God is not like, that you cannot make an image of because it would falsely represent God. A likeness of male or female, a likeness of any animal that is on the earth, a likeness of any winged bird that flies in the air, a likeness of anything that creeps on the ground, the likeness of any fish that is in the water under the earth. like God is not like any of these things, and these things he's pulling from Genesis chapter 1. These are creation categories, general creation categories of living organisms. In Genesis chapter 1, it speaks in very broad categories of things that God created on each day. On this day, God created the birds of the air and the fish of the sea. On this day, God created the beasts of the field. On this day, God created the swarming things. On this day, God created the crawling things. Very broad general categories. And Moses is going through and saying he's not like any of these broad created categories. And notice that first category that he refers to there, male or female. What created category is he referring to there? Well, if he's referring to, a male or female ostrich, well, that would be in any animal that is on the earth, wouldn't it? No, he's very clearly not referring to that. He's saying the likeness of a human being. You shouldn't assume that God is like you, that God is like a human being, either a male human or a female human. That is wrong. That is errant. You cannot make an image of God that is male or female, because God is not a male or female human. That is what Moses is teaching. And of course that flies directly against what the LDS believe, because the LDS believe that God is an exalted man. He has a body of flesh and bone as tangible as a man's. He is a man, just an exalted man. He is your literal father. He is your biological father. Not necessarily in this mortal sense, but in the spiritual sense, he is your literal spiritual father. You are the fruit of his loins, as it were. But the Bible says otherwise. The Bible says that he is not male or female, and the creation category that it is referring to there is the category of human beings. All the other basic categories are mentioned there or implied there. You have the animals of the earth, you have the birds flying in the sky, you have the creeping things, you have the fish. All the other general categories from Genesis chapter 1 are there. What does the male or female refer to? It's referring to human beings. And this also is as an aside, addresses another complaint that the LDS bring up. I've heard LDS people go to Genesis chapter 1 and say, well, in the Bible it says that God made mankind in his likeness. In Genesis chapter 1, God says, let us make man in our image. Let us make man in our likeness. Well, that image and likeness that it's talking about in Genesis is the same kind of image and likeness that it's talking about here in Deuteronomy. When you take a block of wood and you carve a fish out of it, you are creating a likeness of a fish. That doesn't mean that that block of wood is the same species as an actual fish. It might look like it, but it is not actually a fish. That's the same kind of verbiage that's being used in Genesis. LDS people will say, no, it means that we are really the same thing that God is. We're the same basic species, just at different levels of exaltation. That's not how the ancient people would have understood that verbiage. They would have understood it as God taking, basically the equivalent of a block of wood and carving it into something that points to him. For example, if we look at a marble statue of a man, for example, maybe one of the great Greek sculptures, we are reminded when we look at it of man, but it is in fact marble. It is not human. It is not flesh. It is not a man. But it reminds us of man. It points us to man. When the Bible in Genesis chapter 1 says, let us make man in our image, it's doing the same thing. It's saying, let us make man in such a way that he is going to point to us. It's going to point to God. It in no way implies that he is made out of the same material, though, or that he is of the same species, or that he comes from us in any biological or even biologically spiritual sense. That's not how the ancient people used that kind of language. That's not how that language worked. It works the same way that it does here in Deuteronomy 4, where Moses is very clear about the fact that God is not male or female. Specifically, he is not a male or female human being, and that it is wrong to represent him as such. So one of our reasons for not believing that God is like us is because of his name. He is Yahweh. He is the beingizer. He is the one who is transcendent. He is the one outside of all created existence. Everything that is not God is created by God in the biblical worldview. Therefore, we wouldn't assume that he is like any created thing. So his name implies that, but then there's also passages like this that very clearly say, don't represent God as human. Don't represent him as a male human or a female human, or like any other created thing. Not like the birds of the air, not like the things that creep on the ground, not like a fish. And then it even goes on to talk about those who would be tempted to worship other created things, like the sun, the moon, and the stars, anything like that, all of the host of heaven. What is Moses saying here? Moses is saying, don't think that God is like any created thing. He is the one who creates these things. He is not like these things. Don't make the mistake of thinking that he is like them in any way, shape, or form. He is beyond all of them. Okay. The ancient Hebrew people, from the very beginning, had the concept of a transcendent God. He was not a part of existence, unlike the LDS worldview. He transcended it. And because of that, it was wrong to represent him as any part of it, because he wasn't a part of it. He was beyond it all. All right, so this transcendent God, who is beyond everything, creates everything else. Okay, and he creates everything from nothing, just as Romans 4:17 says. And that would include matter. As I've said before, this is unlike the LDS worldview, because in the LDS worldview, God only can refine matter or reorganize matter. He cannot create it. In the biblical worldview, though, matter is a created thing. Also, law comes from God in the biblical worldview. That is, physical laws, moral laws, even laws of logic, all come from God. And in the handout, I give some references for each of these. But the idea in the biblical worldview is that all of these things have a basis in God. If you don't have a transcendent God from whom all things come, who serves as a basis for all these things, you actually don't wind up with a reason for them. Why should there be physical laws in a universe that has no ultimate basis for that physical law? Why should the universal gravitational constant be universal or constant? Why can't it change from place to place and from time to time, so on and so forth? Why is it universal and unchanging? Why should it even exist at all? Why are there moral laws? If there is no ultimate referent for morality, it is ultimately subjective. And in the LDS worldview, this is actually a very major issue, in that, yes, the LDS people definitely have a sense of morality, but as to say in any absolute way that their morality is correct, they don't really have one. They would say, okay, this is the morality that is required of us by our Father God, but where did he get it from? Well, from his Father God, ostensibly. Where did he get it from? From his Father God, ostensibly. Where does the basis for this come from? Where's the ultimate referent that would say objectively that this is right, not just because my daddy said so, but because there is an absolute basis for this to say, no, this is absolutely right, because someone who has absolute authority can actually say that it's right. In the LDS worldview, you don't get that. You get an infinite chain of gods with no absolute reference. The law becomes a detached thing, and ultimately an arbitrary thing. Why it should be this way and not any way else ultimately becomes a matter of, well, this is the way we've always done it. This is the way that we've decided to go, and therefore that's the way we're going to go, but there's no absolute reason why it has to be that way. In the biblical worldview, on the other hand, there is an absolute reason why these particular things are right and wrong. It's because the one who is absolutely in control of everything said this is what is right and wrong. And the same thing even goes for laws of logic. In a worldview that does not have an absolute God who is in control of everything, there is actually no particular reason why laws of logic should even exist. There's plenty of LDS people that do believe in laws of logic. You know, I've seen them crossing the streets, and they definitely believe in the law of the excluded middle. That is, it is going to be the bus or you. It is not going to be both you and the bus. That doesn't work. They definitely believe in laws of logic and very practical everyday applications. They definitely do. But their worldview doesn't account for why there would be absolute laws of logic, because there is no absolute lawgiver in their worldview. You have an infinite chain of gods before God and an infinite chain of gods after God. You have no idea where laws of logic come from. They just exist. For them, it's basically just kind of like matter. It's just there. It's like the intelligences. They're just there. There's no particular reason why they should exist or be the way they are. It's also, by the way, the same problem that the atheists have. The atheists try to use logical reasoning against Christians, but the irony is that their worldview doesn't give any particular reason why logic should even exist in the first place. They have to borrow from our worldview, from the biblical Christians' worldview, in a sense, to argue against it. Our worldview doesn't offer a reason why there should be any absolute laws of logic, but we'll try to use logic against you anyways. It's about as ironic as the man who is trying to argue that air doesn't exist, all the while breathing out air as he speaks the words, air does not exist. It's the same kind of problem. The LDS worldview doesn't have a basis for law, for physical, moral, or logical law. It assumes their existence, but there's no particular reason why any particular one of them should exist the way that it is, or why you should believe that it's absolute in the LDS worldview. There's no absolute referent for them. In the biblical worldview, there is. And that is the God of the Bible, Yahweh, the being-izer, the one who serves as the basis for all things, including physical, moral, and logical law. Also, God creates angels, which are not human. The text is very specific about that. What is that? Psalm 18, 19, somewhere in there? Specifically speaks of the creation of human beings and angels and puts them in different categories. And some of the angels that are described in the Bible are very much so clearly not human. Describes them as having wings and covered with eyes and all these kinds of things, and you're just sitting there going, yeah, whatever that is, that's not me. I'm pretty sure that's not me. And the reaction of humans in the Bible whenever they encounter an angel is a reaction of fear and great trepidation. And even the Apostle John made the mistake of bowing before an angel. And he was reprimanded by the angel, saying, who said, I'm a servant in the same way that you're a servant. By the way, he wasn't saying that he was human like the Apostle John was human. He's saying, I'm a servant. I serve God just as you are to serve God. I glorify God just as you are to glorify God. He wasn't saying he was the same species as the Apostle John. But he was clearly of a different order. And the Apostle John, even though it was wrong for him to bow to this angel because he's only supposed to bow to God, he recognized that he was very much so of a different class of being than himself. And the text, like I said, it's either in Psalm 18 or Psalm 19, specifically speaks of man as being created lower than angels. This is how he was made. Angels were made and mankind was made, and they were made distinctly different. And mankind was created for a lower level kind of existence than angels were. Again, that flies against the LDS faith, because the LDS faith says that some humans can become angels. Not what the Bible teaches. All right, then of course God creates everything that is of the normal earthly order, so that would include humans, plants, animals, all those kinds of things. Another thing that God of the Bible creates that is very different from the LDS worldview is that the God of the Bible creates both good and evil. For example, Isaiah 45:7. Isaiah 45:7 says that God is the one who creates calamity and well-being, the one who creates light and darkness. The biblical worldview is a strictly monotheistic worldview in the sense that all being that is not God comes from God. And that includes good and bad. And a lot of other worldviews that are out there, and it's not just the Mormons that have this problem, but there's lots of worldviews out there, and even ones that would claim to be biblically Christian, They don't really do very well with passages like Isaiah 45:7 and others, but there's a lot of worldviews out there that would say, good stuff comes from God and evil stuff comes from some other source. It might be from Satan, it might be from, some demiurge, it might be from human beings themselves being capable of creating their own evil, etc., etc. But those are not biblical worldviews. The biblical worldview is very clear that everything that is not God comes from God. And that includes both good and evil. And the God of the Bible uses both good and evil to glorify himself. Okay. So that is different from what a lot of LDS people think in terms of. But it is a part of our worldview. And if you want to talk to us in a meaningful way, that's something that you're going to have to address one way or the other. All right, and then also as a part of what God creates, he creates the three heavens. And for the biblical worldview, the three heavens are not talking about a future eternal state or anything like that. They are talking about something that is a part of the created order itself. It does not transcend the created order in any way. It's very much so a part of the material universe for the most part. Well, at least the first two heavens are. The first heaven is that which is beyond the earth, what we would normally call the sky or the atmosphere. The second heaven is what is beyond the sky, beyond what we would call the atmosphere, so that would be space. And then the third heaven is, in fact, transcendent, and that's what's beyond all of these things, and that would be the transcendent realm, the realm that belongs properly only to God, or at least beyond the material universe. Okay. And let me explain that in just a little bit more detail. Let's talk about some of the passages that deal with this issue of the heavens. 1 Kings 8:27 and Psalm 148, 3-5 are relevant to this. In 1 Kings chapter 8, King Solomon is dedicating the temple that he has made, and he's talking about what will this temple actually do. And for a lot of ancient people, the temples were seen as, kind of the dwelling place of the gods in a sense. And Solomon takes up that question with regard to his God, with regard to the God of the Bible. And it leads him to say this. Solomon said, "But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Is this going to be the dwelling of God?" is basically what he is saying. And then he goes on to say, "Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built?" When he says heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you, he's talking about things in the created order. So here's this one building on earth that we have, but heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you, God. He's talking about what I said before about the sky and the atmosphere, and about space. And he's saying that neither of these things can contain you, how much less this puny little house that I have built. Obviously, this is not your dwelling place in the proper sense. And the way that these other pagan people might think that their God can actually dwell in a particular location like this, our God cannot. He transcends everything. He is beyond earth, but he's also beyond the atmosphere. He's also beyond space. He's beyond all that, is what Solomon is saying. He cannot be contained in this way. And this is also, by the way, where the doctrine of the omnipresence of the biblical God comes from. Solomon understood that there is nothing in created existence that contains God. He is in and through everything. He is not contained by any of it, nor can he be contained by any of it. He is the transcendent and therefore omnipresent God. He's in and through everything. Okay, so that's part of it. And then in Psalm 148, verses 3-5, the psalmist says this. The psalmist says, "Praise him," speaking of God, "sun and moon, praise him, all you shining stars. Praise him, you highest heavens, and you waters above the heavens. Let them praise the name of Yahweh, for he commanded and they were created." This again puts the idea of the heavens, the multiple levels of heavens that the Bible talks about, in terms of the created order, in the terms of the material universe. Now, some people get caught up with the fact that Psalm 148 speaks of heavens in the plural, while passages like 1 Kings speak of heaven in the singular. And people who know the language know that that's not a big deal. Some people say, well, one of them is talking about, the heavens of the material existence, and the others are talking about heaven of a transcendent existence, of, the three levels of heaven, that are not a part of our material universe, as we know it at least. They would say there's a difference because one's singular and one's plural. The problem with that, though, is that in the Hebrew mindset, the concept of heaven itself was both a singular and a plural, and that is because it was an aggregate substance. That is, it was something that was made up of parts. The first heaven, the lower heaven, not the highest heaven, as it's talked about here. The first heaven was a heavens. It was made up of multiple things. It was made up of the wind. It was made up of the clouds. It was made up of precipitation. It's a place where the birds were. There's a bunch of things that were in the lowest heaven, and therefore it could be referred to as the heavens, because there's a bunch of things in it. And the same thing with the heaven that was above that. The Hebrew people recognize very plainly that while there is definitely an existence, a state of beyondness in which there are clouds and wind and precipitation, there's also these things that are beyond all of those things, that are things like the sun, moon, and stars here. We have sun, moon, shining stars here. All those things are beyond these beyond things. They're beyond the clouds, they're beyond the wind, they're beyond precipitation, and because of that they make the beyond things of the beyond things. And so literally in the Masoretic text and in the Septuagint, it will literally say the heavens of heavens. And so that would literally mean the beyond things of the beyond things, or the things that are beyond the things that are beyond, is another way that it could be translated, which would be kind of choppy in English, so we don't usually translate it that way, but that would be a very literal rendering. The things that are beyond the things that are beyond. And this is a very Hebrew way of explaining it, but for the Hebrews, thinking of the heavens in terms of the plural of the things that they're made up of, first heaven being made up of the clouds and the wind and precipitation, and the highest heaven, at least of our material universe, as being made up of the sun, moon, and the stars and everything beyond that, as well as referring to them in the singular, the heaven and the highest heaven, was not a big deal for them. They recognized that it was this thing, but this thing was made up of parts, and so they would see it as a singular and a plural, and they would use those interchangeably all the time. And this is also another reason why the people of God don't really have a big problem with God being both singular in one sense and plural in another sense. God is one in being and three in person was not a very big deal to people early on. I mean, all the way back in Genesis, you have the idea that there is only one Yahweh, very much so implicitly present to the text. But you also have places like the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, where Yahweh on earth rains down fire from Yahweh in heaven. There's obviously a plurality in Yahweh as well. For the Hebrew people, this wasn't a big deal, because they saw a lot of things in aggregate, just like they saw heaven in aggregate. Heaven was made up of the heavens, of multiple things. Like I said, the wind, kind of the air that we breathe, the clouds that were floating in that air, the precipitation that came from those clouds. There was a bunch of things that made up heaven. And the highest heaven was a place where the sun, moon, and stars were. It was made up of parts as well. But there was still a sense in which it was one thing, and a sense in which it could be many things. So just because one is singular and one is plural is not a big deal. It's both referring to the same thing. And in the New Testament, when Paul speaks of the third heaven, he's saying what is beyond all this. He's referring basically to what Solomon was referring to. He's saying, Solomon said that heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you, God. And so what that would imply is that there's an existence, a state of beyondness that is even beyond all the things in material existence. A third heaven, if you will. And if you read through Jewish literature chronologically, you see this idea that is enunciated in the Old Testament with phrases like this, where they talk about heaven and the highest heaven, two heavens that are part of this material universe, you'll also see, especially more so towards the intertestamental literature and the New Testament literature, where the Jewish people start talking about the third heaven properly, in which God dwells, that which is beyond material existence. That's what Paul was referring to. He wasn't referring to some state that is indicative of the afterlife or anything like that. He was just simply saying that he was, in some sense, caught up to the proper dwelling place of God that is not a part of this material existence. We believe in three heavens too. We just don't believe in the three heavens that you do. We believe in the three heavens that the Bible talks about: the atmosphere, space, and the proper dwelling of God, which is beyond the atmosphere and space. All right. 3, the covenant of works. So, what is eternal? God. What did God create? Everything that is not Him. And as a part of creation, He, of course, creates mankind. And with mankind, there is what is called the covenant of works. And the covenant of works is a commandment to obey. Adam was asked to obey God. And he was asked to obey God in one particular area. There was definitely a stated purpose that God had in creating Adam. God said, I create him to tend the garden. That's what he's going to do. He is a part of this created order that I've mentioned. He has a place and a purpose in this created order. But God asks Adam to do one particular task and put special emphasis on that one particular task. Don't eat from this tree, basically. Don't eat from this, and as long as you don't eat from this, everything will be good between us. And of course, Adam does not do that. Instead, he does eat from the forbidden fruit, and he falls, he fails. This covenant, in the biblical worldview, isn't like in the LDS worldview. In the LDS worldview, the covenant of works is basically kind of a trick to see if Adam would be able to figure out what the most important thing to do is. Because in the LDS worldview, Adam was basically given two competing commandments. One was to be fruitful and multiply, and the other one was not to eat from the forbidden tree, and to eat the forbidden fruit, I should say. And in the LDS worldview, what Adam did by eating from the forbidden fruit was a good thing, because it allowed him to be fruitful and multiply, which was part of God's plan, God the Father's plan of exaltation for all mankind. And so God needed Adam to do that. And so Adam had to make the right choice in the commandments that he would follow, and realize what is most important to God. And what is most important to God is getting his spirit children into spirit bodies. And so it was a good thing that Adam ate the fruit in the LDS worldview. In the biblical worldview, the fall of Adam was indeed a fall. Adam was basically given one job. Like I said, he did have a more general purpose for Adam. But as far as this covenant of works was concerned, what he was specifically tasked with doing to be in right standing with God was just one simple thing: don't eat this fruit. That's it. And Adam couldn't even do that. And in the biblical worldview, what this did is it showcased the weakness of mankind. It showcased the weakness of Adam, but thereby the smallness of humanity. And a lot of people would say, well, that seems a little bit unfair. So you're saying that God set up a test for Adam that he knew Adam would fail. Yes, that is exactly what we're saying. It wasn't a good thing that Adam ate the fruit. Instead, what this did is it showed to Adam and Eve and to all of mankind thereafter that mankind, Adam is actually literally the word for man, showed that mankind was inherently weak in and of himself, that he was inherently small in and of himself, that man could not expect to do things by himself, even simple things by himself. It was to showcase to man what he is made of, and it's not much. Again, a lot of people would say, well, that seems rather mean on God's part. And again, it goes back to God's purpose. God's purpose is not to exalt man. God's purpose is to glorify himself. And that includes not letting man think too much of himself. I kind of liken it back to my days when I was teaching. I used to teach mathematics at the high school level, and sometimes I would have kind of uppity students that would think that they didn't need my help anymore, and sometimes that was genuinely true. There were students that really knew their stuff, and they were frankly placed in the wrong class, and they really didn't need my help. They were well beyond it, and that was great, fine, wonderful by me. But there were also a lot of students that were just flat out arrogant, and they thought that they were, the greatest thing since sliced bread or whatever. And you figure out pretty quickly which ones actually know what they're talking about and which ones are arrogant. And to pipe down, to shut up the arrogant ones, I would very frequently give them a fairly basic question for them to answer. They say, oh, this is all old stuff. I already know how to do all this. And so what I would generally do is I would just take something from the next concept over, literally the next thing that we were going to be studying in that lesson, apply it in a somewhat unique way, put it in terms of a word problem or something like that, and give it to them and say, okay, if you can do this, I'll pass you on to the next thing and you don't need me anymore. But if you can't solve this, you need to shut up for the rest of the class and take notes along with everybody else and accept that, no, you don't know everything. And lo and behold, the ones that were arrogant were indeed arrogant, and they would fail the problem, and they would shut them up, and we'd go on with the rest of the lesson. Arrogance is something that the God of the Bible absolutely hates. And people thinking that they're something special in and of themselves is something that God hates. And so there are times where, just to demonstrate how little man should think of himself and how arrogant man is in and of himself, God will give mankind very simple tasks and say, okay, if you can do this, great. And they're not able to do it. And God's response is, you weren't so great, were you? That is the point of it. Mankind is arrogant, has a tendency towards arrogance, and so one of the very first things that God did was to demonstrate to mankind, you can't do it on your own. You're not as great as you think you are. I can give you one simple task and you will still manage to mess that up. Don't get cocky. Don't think much of yourself. Don't be arrogant. Don't be proud. Be humble. Be humble before me, your God. Okay. Adam was never supposed to be able to complete the covenant of works. Adam was supposed to fail. And the reason why Adam was supposed to fail is because it wasn't about Adam. It was about God. Creation serves to glorify God, not man, in the biblical worldview. And that is why ultimately Adam failed. It is because God was making it clear to mankind that mankind was not going to be able to fix things on his own, and that mankind should not trust himself to fix things on his own, that mankind should not be proud and try to work out his own way to heaven, as it were, to work out his own path in life independent of God. Instead, mankind failed at the simplest of tasks. Okay. A few relevant passages on this. There's lots of passages in the Bible that talk about this issue of arrogance, but a couple of them, just for an example point. Let's look at, say, Proverbs 16:5. In Proverbs 16:5 it says, everyone who is arrogant in heart is an abomination to Yahweh. The Hebrew word that's used for, that's translated as abomination is toeva. It is an absolutely horrendous offense to God is what it means. Toeva is just about as offensive to God as you could possibly be. And what does it say is as offensive to God as it could possibly be is someone who is arrogant in heart. In fact, it says everyone who is arrogant in heart is an abomination to Yahweh. It goes on to say, be assured he will not go unpunished. One of the things that God hates most is arrogance, is thinking that you can do it on your own, is thinking that you're great stuff, thinking that it's all about you. One of the first things God did was to set up a test for man to show mankind that you can't do it on your own, that it's not all about you. You fail. Going on to Isaiah 2:17. It says, and the haughtiness of man shall be humbled, and the lofty pride of men shall be brought low, and Yahweh alone will be exalted in that day. I'll let you read the context to figure out what in that day refers to. It might not refer to what you think it means. But the point here in this passage, this is a judgment passage. There's lots of judgment passages in the Bible. And it often speaks of God doing something in that day or in the day of the Lord, when God comes to judge the nations. And a very frequently recurring theme in God's judgment of the nations, of God's judgments of Israel, or God's judgment of particular people, is the arrogance of particular people, or of the Israelites, or of the nations in general. God hates the haughtiness of mankind. The haughtiness of mankind, whereby mankind tries to do things independent of God and tries to forge their own way instead of going through God. And isn't that the temptation that was laid before Eve by the serpent? Eat this and you will be as wise as God. And that is also the great tragedy of the fall, is that temptation to be like God is what led to mankind's demise in the fall. Here is the simple task that I'm going to give you, and you're going to fail in completing this simple task because you're not content with your own position here in the garden that I've given you. Instead, you're going to try to be like me. You're going to try to take my place. And because of that, you will be condemned because of that. Okay, God does not tolerate usurpers. And anyone who would try to form a system of belief that does not reflect who God actually is, that does not reflect the reality of what God created earth to be and who God is an affront to God, is an abomination to God, is an enemy of God, is a rebel against God. That is the fundamental problem of the fall, is that issue of trying to be like God, and in so doing failing the simplest of tests, all because they were not content with what they had, but wanted to be something else and thought that they had a right to be something else. They thought they had the right to be like God. That is the biblical worldview regarding mankind. Mankind's fundamental flaw, as it were, is pride, is arrogance, is thinking that he can be or should be like God in some way, shape, or form, rather than being what he was created to be. That man is malcontent. He is a malcontent. All right, in this fall, it needs to be understood was what is called a federal fall. Federalism is sometimes a little bit hard to explain, but the basic concept is pretty simple. It can be likened to a head of state, a president or a king or something like that. This is a person who has the power to put things into place that will affect everyone who is under them. When a king makes an edict for his nation, it affects everyone in the nation. When a president signs an executive order, it affects everyone in the nation who is under the authority of that executive order. It affects everyone, basically whether they like it or not. That is what is meant by saying that Adam fell federally. It affected everyone. It wasn't just a decision that he made for himself, but it was a decision that would have very real repercussions for everyone who would follow him. Not just him and his wife, but everyone that would follow thereafter would be affected by what Adam did. That's what we mean when we say that Adam fell federally. It was something that affected everybody else, basically. One of those effects is that humans became innately rebellious towards God. We believe that Adam, in a basic sense, was essentially neutral. That God created Adam such that he could tend towards either good or evil, towards submission to God as king and obey the commandment, or to usurpation of God as king, and in trying to become like God himself, disobedient towards God. And the path that Adam chose was rebellion, and since he was the federal head of mankind, what he did led everybody else to take on his nature of rebellion. He, in a sense, started out neutral. It was not necessarily bad or necessarily good, but he made a choice to be evil, and that created a tendency in everyone else that would follow in his footsteps. Everyone that would be born of Adam. And another effect of Adam's fall is that God's earthly reign was disordered. And this word disordered is very important. We don't believe that God's earthly reign here on earth was completely destroyed or that it was completely removed. If it was, gravity would cease to work properly. Laws of logic would no longer hold. Maybe you could walk out in front of the bus, and instead of becoming a little smear on the road, the bus would suddenly become a bounce house, and it would all be good and fine and wonderful. God's reign was not removed from the earth, but it was, in a sense, disordered. And in the sense that mankind would no longer be innately interested in keeping God's order. But that doesn't mean that God abandoned earth completely. Laws of logic still hold. Laws of nature still hold, etc., etc. But earth is now a place of rebellion, and because of that, God's reign is, in a sense, disordered. Okay, so those are the two major effects of Adam's fall. Humans become innately rebellious, and God's earthly reign is disordered. Not destroyed, but disordered. All right. Talking specifically about the change in nature, this is something that a lot of groups don't like. Mormons as well as a lot of other groups. And this is getting fairly long here, so I'm probably going to do this video in two parts. I'm going to finish up with section 4 here, and then I'm going to do 5, 6, and 7. If you're looking at the handout, I'll do 5, 6, and 7 on another night, just because I want to be respectful of people's time. The biblical worldview covers a lot of ground, so that is what it is. I'll wrap this up after this explanation here. But talking about the fall of mankind affecting everybody else, lots of people balk at that teaching, and they absolutely hate that teaching. Okay, Adam fell, but his fall didn't make me bad. A lot of people don't like that idea, but that is the biblical worldview. And the reason why we believe that what Adam did made everybody else bad is because that is, in fact, what the Bible actually teaches. People don't like it, but that is what it says. For example, in Romans 5:19, it says this: "For as by one man's disobedience the many were made katistatheson, by external means only, sinners, so by one man's disobedience the many will be made righteous." What does this mean? Well, this is Paul speaking to the Romans. That's what the book of Romans is. It's Paul's letter to the Romans. So Paul is writing to the Romans, and he's describing what is going to happen in Christ, and he's comparing it to what already happened in Adam. And he talks about the disobedience of Adam, and it says through that disobedience the many were made sinners. The many were made people who would sin. And the word that is used there that we translate as were made is the Greek word katistatheson, and it is a functional passive. And for those of you who are maybe forgot your grammar, there are three basic categories of verbs. There's active verbs, there's middle verbs, and there's passive verbs. A passive verb, or functional passive, indicates that the thing that is receiving the action of the verb is being acted upon. It's not acting upon itself, or it is not the one that is doing the acting. Instead, it is just simply being acted upon. If it was an active verb, it would be the one that's doing the action. If it was middle, it would be giving the action and receiving it. But with this one, it's passive, so it's only receiving the action and is not doing the action. So what this means is that the people following Adam, all of Adam's descendants, they were in fact made sinners, and it was not their own doing, it was Adam's doing. This is not something that they had a vote in any way. It was done, and it was done because of Adam's disobedience. Like I said, there's lots of people that disagree with that in the sense that they don't like it. How can one person's crime be allowed to affect everybody else? Well, whether or not you agree with it, it is what the text says. The text says that people were made sinners by this one man's disobedience, by Adam's disobedience. They didn't do it to themselves, it was done to them. That's what Romans 5:19 says. In Ephesians 2:1-3, it gets even more specific than that. It says, and this is again Paul writing, but this time in the epistle of the Ephesians, it says, "And you were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the powers of the air." He's speaking to Christians and saying, you were once like this. He says, you were once dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind. And we were by nature children of wrath, like the rest of mankind. This text is extremely important because it says that not only was this something that was done external to us, but he's saying that it is something that is innate to us. There are some people that believe that we wind up sinning because Adam basically created a culture of sin that all of mankind's descendants have learned from. And it's this culture that taught sin, and because this culture has taught sin, mankind has learned to sin, and that is why everybody is made sinners, is because we've learned to sin, but it's not innate to us, is what some people say. Well, Ephesians 2:1-3 specifically counteracts that idea. It's not that you learned to sin, it is that it is innate to you. When Paul says that we were, all of us, were by nature children of wrath, the word that he uses there is phusē. Some people will transliterate it with a Y instead of a U. And that's perfectly valid to do. The Greek letter there is upsilon. I transliterate it with a U because upsilon, for me, comes out more as a U sound. But through transliteration into English through the centuries, it is actually more commonly gotten transliterated with the Y sound that kind of sounds like a short I. Like the Y in mystery actually comes from Greek as mysterion, but we transliterate it into English as mystery, M-Y, mystery, instead of mystery. Either one is perfectly valid, don't get caught up on that. But the Greek word is phusē, and it's actually the exact same Greek word that Paul uses, and he uses it in the exact same inflected form as well in Galatians 2:15, to speak of the natural way that one becomes a Jew. He said in Galatians 2:15, he speaks about those of us who are Jews by nature, who are naturally Jews, that we do this because we were born this way. We are Jews because we were born as Jews. Well, here he's using that same terminology, but he's talking about it in terms of being children of wrath. He's saying by nature we were children of wrath. We were born that way. Not we learned to become children of wrath. Not that we learned to do wicked, evil things, that we learned to follow the desires of the body and the mind. No, he says we were by nature those things. And where does he put the locus here? He says that we once lived in the passions of our flesh. We carried out the desires of the body and the mind. These are not things that are external to us in his worldview. And not to say that there isn't a sense in which you can't teach someone to do evil. But what he's saying is that the propensity to do evil is innate to the person, that the love of evil is innate to the person, that you are by nature, you are born that way. You are born as a sinner. And what Paul is saying here is not anything new. Even back in the Psalms, you have David himself saying that he was born in iniquity. Some people wrongly assume, because they don't understand the original language, they wrongly assume that means that David thought he was born of, some kind of out of wedlock experience between his mother and a man or something like that. He was an illegitimate child or something like that. That's not how the Greek, not the Greek either, but the Hebrew specifically there reads. It's talking about the innate, his innate nature. How was he born? When it says he was born in iniquity, it means that he was born iniquitous. He was born a transgressor. And this is the same thing that Paul is saying here. It's not a new teaching in any way, shape, or form. It's the same thing, but it is very specific language. Just as one becomes a Jew by nature, just as one can be born a Jew, you can also convert and become a Jew, but just as one can be born a Jew, he's saying that all of us, in and of ourselves, aside from the grace of God, before we become Christians, properly so, before we become proper followers of Christ, we live in our trespasses and sins. We live in the passions of our flesh. We are by nature children of wrath. We were born that way. And he says that it's like the rest of mankind. There's nothing that distinguishes us from anyone else. We were not born better. We were all by nature children of wrath, and the reason why we were is because that is what the fall of Adam did to us. It was by the disobedience of one man that we were made, katistatheson, by external means only, into sinners. We didn't do it to ourselves. It is what we have innately become because of Adam's disobedience. And because of that, it is now phuse. It is by nature. It is by birth. It is exactly as one can be a Jew by birth. You are a child of wrath by birth. And you are a child of wrath by birth because of Adam's fall in the garden. That is very clear in the original language. Lots of people don't like it, but it is the biblical worldview. And it's very different from the LDS worldview that strongly emphasizes choice. And it's not like we don't believe that there are any choices, but we believe that mankind has a nature that will always, in and of itself, tend towards sin. We are going to carry out the desires that we have. The problem is that our desires are the desires of the body and the mind, that is by nature an object of wrath. It is the desires of our wicked flesh. It is, we do what we want to do, in a sense, and we are very willful in so doing. The problem is that we act according to our nature, and our nature is evil. And we inherited that from Adam. Adam chose to follow the path of trying to usurp God, of trying to become like God rather than being content in his own place. And that led us all to become rebels with him. We are by nature rebels against God. In the next video, we'll talk about the remedy to this in the biblical worldview. In the biblical worldview, the state of mankind is, in and of itself, very, very, very bad. We are in a very bad state in and of ourselves. We, we are rebels against God. We are God haters by nature. Things look pretty grim for us. In the next video, though, we'll talk about why us biblical Christians can have any hope at all. If this is the way that we're born, what good is there? That's a very valid question. So we'll talk about that next time. Until then, thank you very much for your time and attention. For those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. For those of you who are not, which unfortunately includes my LDS friends, I pray that you would come to know the true Christ of history, the true Christ of the Bible, the only genuine Savior of mankind. Amen.